What happened with Andy was always abstract. The medical story is that his heart was very bad, but he had lived a lifestyle that, you know, very few of us in the family even knew about. So it's actually been a bloody tough decade, you know, since I guess losing Mo.
For decades, whispers have surrounded the Gibb family, rumors of brilliance, heartbreak, and secrets left unspoken. At 78, Barry Gibb has finally broken his silence, sharing truths he once kept guarded from the world. But what could compel one of music's most enduring icons to finally open up now? And what does it reveal about the bond between brothers that fame, success, and tragedy could never erase? This is more than a story of music. It's a story of love, regret, and a legacy that still echoes today. Barry's long-silenced confession. For most of his career, Barry Gibb built walls around his grief. To the public, he was the steady anchor of the Bee Gees, the frontman with the soaring falsetto, the songwriter behind some of the greatest pop hits of all time, and the last surviving Gibb brother whose responsibility became carrying the family's musical legacy. Yet beneath the spotlight, Barry carried a story that remained largely unspoken for decades. The complicated, heartbreaking truth about his youngest brother, Andy. At 78 years old, with the weight of time pressing upon him, Barry finally allowed himself to speak with a candor that stunned even longtime fans. Andy Gibb was not just the baby of the family. He was Barry's little shadow, the one he instinctively wanted to protect, nurture, and guide. When Andy first picked up a microphone, Barry didn't just see potential, he saw brilliance. He often described Andy as having the purest pop voice of them all, a voice that could rival or even surpass the harmonies that had made the Bee Gees household names. Yet Barry also saw something else, something far more fragile, a vulnerability in Andy's spirit that made him both magnetic on stage and dangerously unguarded off it. When Barry speaks of Andy now, it is with a mix of glowing pride and unbearable regret. He recalls the thrill of producing Andy's first hits, standing behind him as both mentor and cheerleader, pouring his own creative energy into shaping Andy's career. Songs like I Just Want to Be Your Everything and Shadow Dancing weren't just Andy's triumphs, they were Barry's gifts to his younger brother. The world saw a golden boy with movie star looks and chart-topping hits. But Barry saw a young man still searching for identity, still desperate for acceptance, and still far too young to shoulder the crushing demands of fame. And here lies Barry's deepest confession. For years, he dodged direct questions about Andy's struggles, carefully framing his brother's legacy as one of light, charm, and talent. But at 78, Barry finally admitted what he had carried in silence. He often wonders if he failed Andy. In rare interviews, Barry spoke of sleepless nights and lingering questions that haunted him. Could tougher love have steered Andy away from self-destruction? Could stepping back or stepping in differently have saved him? He described it not as guilt in the traditional sense, but as an unshakable ache, an older brother forever questioning whether he did enough. What makes Barry's words cut so deeply is the raw honesty in his voice. He does not speak with bitterness or judgment, but with a sorrow that time has only magnified. Andy's death at 30 wasn't just the loss of a brother, it was the loss of a future that Barry still believes could have been extraordinary. He admitted that his baby brother's absence remains a shadow over every success he has achieved since. No Grammy, no Hall of Fame induction, no sold-out show could erase the empty space where Andy should have stood. And perhaps the most stirring detail shared by Barry was regarding the last days they had together. He further revealed that just before Andy turned 30, He quarreled with him for some slight indifference, which, at that time, did not seem to matter much. As it turned out, Barry did not dream that those would be the last words spoken by each other face to face. Days later, Andy was no more. It is an unresolved tension Barry has carried for decades and serves to remind him that even families with all love do not always have a chance to come together again. For Barry, telling truth at 78 was not rewriting Andy's story, but humanizing it. Andy, for him, was not a cautionary tale in life or a tragedy for tabloid newspapers. He was his kid brother, brilliant, very kind, very funny, but tragically fragile. His confession revealed all the human cost of fame, painful balance between love and helplessness, and the scars that remain when a family loses one of its brightest stars. Yet while Barry confesses his private sorrow, the world still remembers Andy for his radiant stage presence, a brilliance best captured in a single unforgettable performance. Andy's command performance for Reagan. In 1981, Andy Gibb walked onto one of the most prestigious stages of his career. The occasion was a command performance, a televised variety show held at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., honoring President Ronald Reagan and the First Lady. The evening was filled with music royalty: Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash, Andy Williams, even Luciano Pavarotti. Yet, it was the youngest of the Gibb brothers who would leave the audience speechless. At just 23 years old, Andy Gibb delivered a performance that not only captured the attention of a president, but also reminded the world that his talent deserved to stand shoulder to shoulder with his famous siblings. Introduced by his girlfriend at the time, actress Victoria Principal, Andy stepped into the spotlight with a calm confidence that belied his age. The song he chose was a bold one. Words, written and made famous by his brothers Barry, Robin, and Maurice. It was a track the Bee Gees had already cemented as one of their most iconic ballads. For Andy to claim it as his own in front of such a prestigious audience was both daring and deeply symbolic. He was not content to be known as just the Baby Gibb. He wanted to show the world that his artistry was powerful in its own right. As he sang, the room fell silent. Viewers and attendees alike marveled at the way Andy's voice carried the same warmth, vibrato, and falsetto that Barry himself had made legendary. In that moment, the comparisons were unavoidable. Andy didn't just resemble his elder brother in appearance. He was a mirror of Barry's sound, capable of reaching the same emotional heights and vocal purity. Some fans would later say it was as though Barry's essence lived inside Andy's voice, but with a fresh twist that made it uniquely his own. It was not merely a technical performance, it was revelation indeed. Andy soared through the song with clarity and conviction. Immediately externalized for many, the song bore the stamp of all that was true for Andy. A proud Victoria Principal beamed into the camera as she introduced him, but it was really all of the standing ovation that finally validated everything Barry and his brothers had always regarded. Andy Gibb was going to be a star. And then, perhaps because he could now finally claim the phases of passage, a moment of glory for Andy as he performed Me, Without You, a song he wrote himself before a live audience for the first time ever. It was Riley's at-home evidence that put Andy right there with Barry, Robin, and Maurice. Not in terms of being hidden in the shadows of the Bee Gees, but in terms of walking out into the light as himself. For decades to come, fans will repeat this night from the footage, usually with some emotion or other. Never fails to receive a mention for the fact that there are so many who believe that Andy bore a ruthless resemblance, not only in looks, but also in the way he was able to match the falsetto and vibrato techniques that were so ripe with the association of the Bee Gees' sound. Some have said that chills ran through them when Andy sang the song, while others said he created a beautiful contrast of youth and energy with the matured, timeless quality of the song itself. To this day, it remains one of the performances with the most citations to prove Andy's true potential. For Barry, it turned out to be something that brought both shadows of bitterness and sweetness when he looked back on that performance many years later. For it marked, on the one hand, validation proving that his little brother had chops beyond mere pop idol with transient hits. And on the other, it reminded him of what, in the end, the world lost. To watch Andy perform words with such command only deepened Barry's sense of sorrow that Andy's career and his life would end before they reached their full promise. But as Andy's star rose on global stages, behind the curtain, his private battles were already beginning to take their toll. The fragile side of fame. From the outside, Andy Gibb seemed to have it all. He was young, handsome, and brimming with charm that made audiences swoon the moment he stepped on stage. His smile seemed effortless, his energy boundless, and his voice carried the kind of warmth that made listeners feel as though he was singing only to them. To millions of fans, Andy embodied the dream of youth and stardom, a golden boy born into one of music's most famous families. Yet behind that carefully polished image, Barry and the rest of the Gibb family saw something different, a fragility that most outsiders never suspected. Andy had always been sensitive, even as a child. While his older brothers were hardened by the struggles of trying to make it as a group in the 1960s and early 1970s, Andy grew up watching their success unfold. By the time he launched his own career, the Gibb name was already synonymous with international stardom. That fame opened doors for Andy that might have taken other artists years to access, but it also created a pressure that weighed heavily on him. He wasn't just competing against other singers on the charts, he was measuring himself against Barry, Robin, and Maurice, legends who had already conquered the world. The problem wasn't Andy's talent. Barry himself would later say Andy had the purest pop voice of all the Gibb brothers. The problem was the pace. In hardly a week, Andy transformed himself from a dream-filled teenager into a global major star with #1 hits alongside sold-out shows and fans eulogizing him. Just at 19, Andy had not hardly carved his identity when this kind of sudden success could be termed dangerous and intoxicating. It was fame that brought along the deepest loneliness. Though continually surrounded by admirers, those relationships offered little of what the young man really craved. The more successful he became, the more he needed grounding, something stardom could never offer. According to Barry, this craving for acceptance usually opened Andy up to not only rough relationships, but also tempting situations in the entertainment world. Laughter, zymotic, and endless late nights became an easy escape, cloaking those insecurities that Andy was too proud to put on view before passengers. He would later destine the helplessness of those years for himself. The eldest brother assumed that he was Andy's protector and mentor, having all love and counsel. But then, there were occasions when Andy slipped further away. Barry frequently expressed the opinion that Andy was chasing something which could never be caught. For example, unconditional acceptance, liberation from his own doubts, and peace that no amount of fame could ever provide. It was agonizing watching his brother slide into cycles of self-destruction, and Barry often bore the burden of wondering if there was something more he could have done. Yet, through it all, Andy never lost his ability to light up a stage. The truth was, Andy, in spite of his woes, never stopped receiving acclaim from the audience in his performances. His charisma wasn't a show, it was really, even if it was temporary. While fans saw the star, smiling and confident, his family knew the war raging within. In the years that followed, Barry, who had watched helpless, found it painful to see his youngest brother carry so great a burden behind such a dazzling facade. Still, there were moments when Andy's brilliance broke through the darkness, and his solo career would prove just how bright his light could shine. A voice that echoed Barry's. When Andy Gibb opened his mouth to sing, fans often did a double take. The resemblance to Barry wasn't just physical, it lived in his voice. The vibrato, the falsetto, the warmth that seemed to wrap around a lyric like velvet. It was all there. For Bee Gees fans, hearing Andy was like hearing an echo of the group's frontman, only with a youthful energy that made him stand apart. Critics quickly noticed that Andy carried shades of Barry's vocal power, but infused it with his own unique brightness, a quality that set him on a path to stardom separate from his brothers. In the late 1970s, Andy burst onto the music scene with a string of hits that catapulted him into the spotlight. His debut single, I Just Want to Be Your Everything, written and produced by Barry, shot to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1977. It was a stunning achievement for a teenager just breaking into the industry, and it signaled to the world that Andy wasn't riding on the Bee Gees' coattails. He was a force in his own right. The song's success was followed by Love Is, Thicker Than Water and Shadow Dancing, the latter becoming one of the defining hits of the disco era. Shadow Dancing, in particular, showed Andy at his peak. The song, co-written with his brothers, became a massive hit worldwide, proving that Andy could not only deliver pop magic, but also carry the same creative spark that ran through the Gibb bloodline. His albums sold millions, his concerts sold out, and his face appeared on magazine covers across the globe. By 20, Andy was a heartthrob with chart dominance, a level of fame that many artists spend a lifetime chasing. There was pride and amazement, Barry recounted. He freely admitted that Andy had, amongst all the Gibb brothers, the most innocent pop voice. He had an exceptional talent of effortlessly moving between an angelic falsetto and a powerful chest voice, imbuing emotion into a melody or dazzling an audience with little more than a smile. Barry would describe Andy as the brother that possessed the most natural star quality, whereby his voice and essence seemed almost automatic. Where Barry had a capacity to sing, Andy had the emotional freedom to sing in his own style, and there was nuance in his tone, the recognition of which was immediate. For Barry, it was very close to home to work with Andy. To him, producing songs for a younger brother was not just about music, but also protecting him, guiding him, and helping him take his place into a world that could be dazzling and brutal at the same time. Barry invested in Andy's career, writing and producing songs that carried Andy's strengths, while demanding him to evolve as an artist. The atmosphere in the studio mirrored their bond as brothers, with moments of encouragement sprinkled with heavy, unspoken responsibility. So much did fans enjoy this whole logic, and Andy seemed to be brought up as the youthful extension of Bee Gees' legacy. Solo star imbibing the same magic, but blossomed under his own light. Younger folks probably never connected with the disco milieu of the Bee Gees, but certainly captured in Andy's boyish charm and romantic ballads. He linked the generations, not just the youngest Gibb. The new #1 hits came with new pressures and demands. For a barely 20-year-old boy, the world was already demanding him to deliver at the same level of perfection, which took decades of his older brothers' lives to achieve. The pace of recording, touring, and public appearances was routinely such that little time left to Andy to catch his breath. Behind the smiling magazine covers and radio anthems was a young man still trying to figure out who he was outside of fame. Barry would later confess that while Andy's success brought with it a great deal of pride, it also possessed an insidious danger. For as Andy's star ascended, the more precarious his foundation would become. And though his voice echoed Barry's, his struggles echoed something much darker, a battle no song could fix. Yet, as the hits piled up, so too did the pressures, pushing Andy toward a fight he could not win alone. Addiction, depression, and despair. As Andy's fame skyrocketed, so too did the weight he carried behind the scenes. The whirlwind pace of his success left little room for pause, and the cracks began to show. Though adored by millions, Andy was wrestling with an enemy that no chart-topping hit could silence: addiction. Cocaine became both his escape and his undoing, a destructive habit that pulled him deeper into a cycle of instability, depression, and self-doubt. Barry and the family watched helplessly as Andy tried to fight his way out. On more than one occasion, he checked into rehabilitation programs, determined to reclaim his health and his future. Each attempt carried hope, a spark that, maybe this time, he would overcome the grip of illegal substances. But each time, the pull of his demons proved stronger than his willpower. The spotlight that once made Andy glow now seemed to expose his fragility, and the industry that celebrated him in public often abandoned him in private. For those closest to him, the contrast was heartbreaking. On stage, Andy still had the ability to dazzle, flashing that boyish smile and delivering songs with the same tenderness fans adored. But offstage, the weight of depression took its toll. In candid moments, Andy revealed the loneliness and fear that haunted him, emotions magnified by the constant scrutiny of fame. The young star who had once seemed invincible was now a man struggling to hold himself together. By the end of 1988, Andy had begun to decline so fast that even his family was shocked. Gibb recalled just how quickly his younger brother seemed to unravel that last year. He represented Andy's mentality as one thoroughly agitated, with depression devouring all the hope that it had possessed. The brightness that had once somewhat denoted Andy's persona was all but replaced by inescapable fatigue. Barry said, pondering this at 78 years, that such dying months would remain in his memory as scars forever. He had mentioned helplessness when watching Andy frequently deteriorate both physically and mentally, knowing that whatever efforts the family undertook to pour out its love on him would never be enough to shield him from what he must endure alone internally. And behind Barry's sorrow hung a question that never left his mind. Could he have done more? In moments of brutal honesty, Barry confessed to wondering if tougher love might have saved Andy. Could stricter boundaries, harsher interventions, or a different kind of guidance have broken the cycle? Or would it have only driven Andy further away? These questions became the ghosts that Barry carried long after Andy's death. He admitted that the guilt was not about failing as a brother, but about never knowing if the choices he made were the right ones. That uncertainty haunted him as much as the loss itself. Fans who adored Andy often remember him as the smiling performer who lit up stages. But for Barry, the truth was more complex. Andy was a soul at war with himself, someone who could pour beauty into his songs while privately feeling hollow inside. This duality of Andy's public shining life but deep private despair is one of the most painful truths that Barry eventually revealed when he expressed all these matters at age 78. The tragedy of addiction and depression is that what they take is less important than what they steal from the world: a person's music, growth, and joy. Decades of sound have gone by, never even having the opportunity to develop. And yet, there was one last spark of hope in this telling by Barry. A plan that, if it could be accomplished, could rewrite Andy's story. But before tragedy struck, there was a flicker of hope. One final plan that could have rewritten Andy's story. The fourth BG that never was. By 1988, Andy Gibb was standing at a crossroads that could have changed everything. Despite the struggles with addiction and depression that had defined much of his 20s, there were signs that Andy was ready to turn the corner. For his family, and especially for Barry, there was reason to hope. That year, the Bee Gees made a monumental announcement. Andy would officially join his brothers as the fourth Bee Gee. It was a move that felt both symbolic and redemptive. After years of walking his own path as a solo artist, Andy would finally step fully into the family fold, strengthening the very legacy that had nurtured him since childhood. The timing seemed perfect. The Bee Gees were already legends, but the addition of Andy promised a fresh chapter. Fans dreamed of the harmony that four Gibb voices could create, each distinct yet united by blood. The thought of Andy standing alongside Barry, Robin, and Morris on stage wasn't just exciting. It felt inevitable, as though the youngest brother was finally coming home. For Barry, the idea of having Andy beside him wasn't simply about music. It was about family, about giving his little brother a place where he could be safe, supported, and celebrated for his gifts, rather than isolated by his struggles. And at the same time, Andy had signed a record deal with Island Records. Now, this was a clear indication that her career was not over. He was busy assembling new material while rehearsing for a revival that could present him to audiences not just as a former teen idol, but as a matured artist with depth and experience. The plans were ambitious: to relaunch the solo career such as it was, and to take on the fourth Bee Gee role at last. For the first time in aeons, the future seemed really promising. Barry would reminisce about these days with a bittersweet tone, recalling the hype that had hung around Andy's new beginnings. That excitement included hearing his brother's voice again, that same voice that once made the charts and won thousands of hearts. For Barry, it had been Andy's talent that had ever been in serious consideration, or, more precisely, whether he would be able to find the stability to match that talent. In 1988, for the first time, it seemed as though things were falling into place. But alas, and under all the positive reasoning, Andy was still fragile. There had been years of substance abuse and trauma, and the tolls on his health were not just going to fade away. Robin Gibb would later confess that, by the early part of 1988, Andy saw a great deal of deterioration in a very short time. His description was of real darkness for Andy, the kind that saw his depression actually worsening as plans for a comeback grew. It was a very alien sort of scenario where Andy was fighting two wars. One war was against his body and mind, and another war was for restoring his position in music. The anguish for Barry watching this unfold was unbearable. He was, on one side, thrilled to at long last properly be welcoming Andy into the Bee Gees, which was a dream he had cherished for years. And when the collapse came, it was sudden, shocking, and devastating, not just for Barry, but for the world. Loss, legacy, and lasting truth. The final chapter of Andy Gibb's story came far too soon. In March of 1988, just days after celebrating his 30th birthday, Andy was admitted to a hospital in Oxford, complaining of chest pains. His body, weakened by years of substance abuse and emotional turmoil, could no longer endure the strain. On March 10th, Andy Gibb died of heart failure. The youngest of the Gibb brothers was gone before he had even reached the prime of his life. leaving behind a career cut short and a family forever changed. For Barry, the news was shattering. He had spent years watching Andy struggle, trying in every way he knew to guide him, protect him, and help him reclaim control. The announcement of Andy's death was not just the loss of a brother. It was the loss of a lifetime of possibilities, a cruel ending to a story that had once seemed destined for greatness. The grief was compounded by the unfinished nature of Andy's journey. There were still albums to be made, concerts to be sung, and memories to be shared. Instead, Barry was left with silence, where there should have been music. Adding to the pain was a personal regret Barry has carried for decades. He revealed, with heartbreaking honesty, that he and Andy had quarreled shortly before Andy's 30th birthday. At the time, it seemed like a minor disagreement, the kind of sibling clash that would blow over in days. Barry never imagined those would be the last words he exchanged with his baby brother. That lingering conflict, unresolved at the time of Andy's death, became a wound that Barry admitted still weighs on him every single day. "I carry that with me," he confessed years later, "and I always will." Yet even in the depths of his grief, Barry refused to let Andy's story end in tragedy alone. Instead, he chose to keep his brother's memory alive through the only language they had always shared most deeply: music. Whenever Barry steps onto a stage, whether performing Bee Gees classics or his own songs, Andy's presence lingers. In interviews, Barry has said that he feels Andy's spirit next to him, that each note sung will be a little way to keep his youngest brother nearby. Andy, for Barry, is not somebody of the past, but one who lives in his day-to-day life, sporting the melodies and harmonies that defined their family, singing for them. This too may preserve Andy's light for fans. Years after his passing, audiences continue to relive concert performances such as his version of Words, or one of his #1 hits, just to marvel at that raw talent which got extinguished too soon. What makes Barry's latest revelations so profound is not merely the sorrow they speak, but rather the truthfulness they exude. At 78, he no longer makes any effort to shield either himself or the fans from the hurt caused by what happened. Instead, he opens what remains of his heart to reveal the myriad levels that love, regret, and family run through death itself. His reflections will not be about retelling Andy's story, but will hold it in honor, the victories, the struggles, as well as the loss. Barry Gibb's honesty at 78 is not just a confession. It's a reminder that behind the music and the fame are human stories of love, loss, and family. Andy's life may have ended too soon, but through Barry's words and every note sung on stage, his light still endures. The truth revealed now gives fans not only a deeper understanding, but a sense of closeness to the brothers we thought we already knew. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And when you're ready for more untold journeys of music's greatest legends, watch the next video on your screen.